Good morning, good evening, good afternoon to everybody. We are still waiting for a few more speakers to join us. Here, my name is Marcos Neto. I'm the director of the Financial Sector Hub at the United Nations Development Program. And I'm delighted to have Giovanna Melandri. She will introduce herself in more detail in a minute. And we, as I said, waiting for other speakers. So if you're joining us here, the conversation is about the role and the importance that the G7 and the G20 platforms have to drive and to maximize and to mainstream impact, and the importance that they play and they have played throughout history in changing the way we see and bringing innovations into the world. We live in an unprecedented times with a tremendous amount of challenges ahead of us. I think we are all seeing how innovative we had to become to join 60 countries and 1,500 people, as Sir Ronnie was talking about. But that's not the first time we faced challenges, right? In the 70s, during the first oil crisis, the G7 was formed. In the 1999, at a ministerial level, responding to the Asia financial crisis, the G20 was formed. In 2008, the G20 added a heads of states, a leaders summit to it as a response to the financial crisis of 2008. So those platforms have existed to deal with moments like this, and perhaps more than ever now, we are dealing with one that is massively affecting all of us at the same time. So the question becomes, how do we also, as Prime Minister Winston Churchill used to say, how do we make sure that we don't let a crisis go to waste? How do we make sure that the moment that we live now allow us to address long-standing problems that COVID has, it didn't cause, it just kind of put a spotlight on it. Inequality, climate, gender imbalance, biodiversity collapses, systemic racism. All of those things have been with us for a long time and we've known it. COVID just surfaced this. So we have a responsibility, and I think this is a perfect platform that the GSG has set up to tackle some of those challenges and to build back better, to build back in a way that we can not only bring the economies back as in the past was done, but fundamentally shift the underlying causes that have been maximized by COVID. And I think the G7 and the G20 have a fundamental role to play. As part of my job at the United Nations, I have been leading and supporting member states of the UN on thinking what recover better for sustainability looks like. And it's incredible that some of what Sir Ronnie was talking in terms of the issues of, impact, accounting, the issues of standards, the issues of regulatory framework, governments are starting to think about it. And that is really the important element of trying to do this. The good news is both the G7 and the G20 have a history of dealing with sustainability. Right now, we, together with the OECD, are actually working at the request of the French presidency, the G7, on creating a sustainable finance framework. Giovanna can give us a little bit of a perspective of a non-government institution and what the Italian might be think as they take over the G20 presidency. We also know that the UK is taking the G7 presidency and is being very keen on maximizing the issues of climate, the climate disclosure, the task force for climate non-financial disclosure, which is also part of the UN conversation. There is a biodiversity non-disclosure conversation going on as well. So the moment is a moment of responsibility, a moment of galvanizing ourselves in that sense, and is incredibly important. And this combination between the UK and the Italian is also relevant because they both are co-chairs of the COP, the Conference of the Parties of the Climate Change. So I think we are entering in a difficult year with a sense of responsibility that I've seen governments doing. And I think it will be important to have that conversation now. And hopefully the other speakers
will join in.
Will be joining. But, you know, let's start it with you, Giovanna. You know.
Yes, thank you very much. Maybe I should just very simply and briefly present myself. I was for many years in government in Italy, and now I am chairing the Italian National Advisory Board to the GSG. Founded a foundation years ago called Human Foundation, working on impact investment. Yes, I think we are at a critical juncture, as Ronnie Cohen said just a few seconds ago. It's a juncture which asks for critical change, and it cannot be just a sort of makeup change. And the role that the role that this movement can have around the world, I think, is crucial and pivotal. Yes, we need to put together the agendas of the G7 and the G20. And let's not forget that I was honored to be part of the G7 task force on social impact investment. And let's not forget that the G7 had a great role at the time after the financial crisis to put the impact agenda on the table. And I think now it's the time to push this forward. We all know how crucial this moment is and how critical it is. I mean, really too many people around the world are not offered dignity and safety, not to speak about the ecological crisis. I don't need to go into depth. This whole summit is going to be around this. But I do think that it's time now also for the G20 to pick up these issues. G20, I think we should remind this, represents 90% of GDP and 2/3 of world population. So this is members of the G20 may have diverse interests. They do have diverse interests. But I think that what COVID is teaching us and what this global crisis is teaching us is that we really need a new page, a new chapter of multilateralism and of coordination at a global scale. So how can we put these agendas together, these platforms together? I think there's a lot of work to do. I think the voice of the South is essential for finding an inclusive political and economical agenda. And also, this is going to be really hard because the critical and challenging moment we already were living in before COVID. I mean, all the problems were there. The ecological problems were there, the poverty, the inequality, the indignity problems, they were all on the agenda. And for these problems, there will never be a vaccine. So let's see how we can go some steps forwards. Okay, first of all, having worked on the G7 task force for social impact investment, what I see crucial coming out now is the issue of shared and agreed metrics to measure economic success beyond GDP. There's a lot. I'm an economist by training myself. I've been working on these issues for many years. I think now the time has come to put on the G7 agenda and on the G20 agenda this issue. We cannot base economic success only on GDP's indicators, and we must do that also on the market scale. One of the things that we are discussing at the GSG level within this movement is the issue of impact transparency as something that should be mandatory for companies, so that companies when they publish their audit financial accounts, these financial accounts reflect their social and environmental impact. This is something that we really share as a important step forward on an international and multilateral level. And I think, well, the Italian NAB, which I have the honor to chair, has already asked our Sherpa to the Prime Minister for an encounter. And one of the requests we will have is to make sure that in the G20 final declaration, there will be a clear reference to impact transparencies for companies. And if I can still talk, waiting for the others to join, I want to...
Nick has joined us, which is great.
Okay, then let me just put on the table another topic, and then I'll leave the word to Nick. I think the COVID crisis has also is giving us the chance of bringing down some taboos. For sure, the use of debt for financing the recovery and an active role for governments. Now, I want to quote Mario Draghi, who some days ago talked about good and bad debt. We don't want to put on the shoulders of the next generations a debt which is not, I would say, productive of impact. So I think the kind of debt which we need to address now, and I think there's an incredible interesting convergence between the G20 and the G7 on this issue, is good debt. And good debt is impactful debt. We need a new season of investments that are impact. And we don't need any kind of investments. We need investments that do create a value chain in social change and environmental change. So I'll leave it to this for this first round of conversation.
Thank you very much, Giovanna. Nick, welcome, to this conversation. And in a minute, it would be great if you can talk a little bit about you and then take it over. But let me just pick it up where Giovanna left to say that yesterday at the UN, we had a 5 hours long typical UN meeting with 75 finance ministers, right, as part of a large process the Secretary General has created. And we came back together as 6 working groups with recommendations from different areas going forward. The issue of debt was a very important issue, and there was a tremendous amount of looking at the G20 and at the G7 for their roles in terms of, not only extending the debt standstill that has already been agreed by the G20, both in terms of length until the end of next year, but more interesting, there was a tremendous amount of demand for that debt standstill to be extended to other countries. For example, to small island states that are dependent on tourism, and the tourism has canceled, which are considered mid-income country, therefore have no access to concessional debt. And then at some point in that conversation, and this is perhaps a little bit different than we had agreed to talk, Nick, there was an issue about using, like Giovanna mentioned, debt as an instrument to advance impact. So debt for SDG, debt for climate, right? And so on and so forth. But from a pure accounting, trying to link back to Cerrone impact accounting, from a pure accounting point of view, debt is debt, right? We haven't created a public finance accounting that differentiated debt yet, right?
We need
so perhaps, Nick, coming back to you to say, one, how do you see this from, having been in government in the UK taking the G7, presidents now? How do you see that the need not only for private sector to start putting impact at the center, right, but perhaps for governments to start to put it impact from the center, like the conversation of debt, and how do you see these being linked to the Bank of England, taking a more encompassed view to consider social issues along with environmental ones, going forward, on the private track of the Bank of England now for the COP. Yeah. So Nick, maybe you can introduce yourself a little bit and then take it over from there.
Marcus, thank you very much for the invitation, and I wish everyone a very productive summer, and a huge pleasure to follow my old friend Giovanna in this session. My bios are somewhere on the website, but briefly, I was a UK government minister for 9 years and led the work with Ronnie Cohen to kind of build out our ecosystem of impact investment in the UK and put impact investment on the G8 agenda as was, and a great privilege to join this important conversation. You asked me about the Bank of England Private Finance Initiative, which is kind of core to the strategy for the COP26, which we have the pleasure of co-hosting with our Italian friends, and that finance strand there is absolutely critical to the strategy for that COP. And that has a very simple objective, which is that every financial decision should take climate change into account. And few people will disagree with that as an objective, but I think our vision is a broader one and an even more ambitious one. As Ronnie has articulated, we want every financial decision to be looked at through three lenses: risk, return, and impact, social and environmental. My main point is we have a very powerful moment to make that argument and to argue for work streams through the G7, the G20, the COP, to kind of help underpin that vision. And I agree with Giovanna. I think the really critical work is around what we measure and trying to get some agreement and standardization around that. But my message really, we have to be bold, and we have to recognize the power of this moment. I think our greatest challenge in terms of pursuing the vision that we share is inertia and the weight of business as usual, and the degree to which it is embedded into normal behavior. And let's be frank, there are plenty of people who do very well out of business as usual. But COVID has shattered that inertia. It has changed political priorities. It has changed our view of what is politically possible. We are doing things here in the UK I could not have imagined just 7 months ago. So eyes are being opened to bigger scales of ambition. Of course, COVID has not just shattered inertia, it's shattered public balance sheets. And so the door is open as it never has been to people who are coming in with arguments or answers to the question, how do we mobilize private capital at scale to help us generate the kind of social and environmental outcomes that we need? And as we've discussed before, Marcus, the wind is in our favor because the world is changing. The views of people are changing, whether we're as consumers, as investors, as voters. We're expressing in different ways that we want something different. And that's important, as Giovanna knows, because politicians are not as brave as they sometimes label out to be. We need to feel that the public are kind of with this. And I sense there is a popular movement for change. And as you said, the stars are aligning in terms of this incredibly important sequencing of events, the COP 26, the G7, the G20. And there's an opportunity for us, if we're properly organized, to insert ourselves into the flow of ideas and priorities into that space. But I just have three very quick suggestions, Marcus, in terms of how. First is we've got to link the social and the environmental. They're inextricably interlinked. Climate change is not just an existential threat, it's a social justice issue because of where the impacts are likely to be most felt. It's also going to require us to change absolutely everything in terms of the systems that we take for granted. And in that massive disruption, there will be winners and losers. And the message to the politicians is, let's make sure that through the COVID recovery and through what we need to do on climate change, which is radical and hugely disruptive, we do not fall into the trap of widening already unacceptable levels of inequality. That is a message that I think has resonance. And for us as a movement, I'll be challenging here. Let's challenge ourselves to be relevant and credible. What do I mean by that? One of my critiques of our movement is that, like most movements, we tend to sit in an echo chamber. Our metrics of success are ones that matter to us, but don't really matter to decision makers. So let us talk about problems that we think we have some of the means to be a solution or part of the solution to. So here in the UK, I'm delighted that the social economy, the impact investment, is now inserted itself into the conversations and the solutions around homelessness and creating jobs for the most vulnerable people in our most vulnerable communities, because that is what the politicians want to hear. They're not interested in social impact bonds or tools or size of funds under management, all the stuff that we spend a lot of time discussing, completely irrelevant to politicians. They have a huge agenda, many, many problems. They want to talk to people who understand those problems and are bringing some solutions. And let's be credible. And you talked about the Bank of Finance strategy. At the heart of that is the TCFD, this transformation in disclosure, systemic, because what it means is that carbon risk is now seen as a huge operating risk for companies that needs to be managed. From information comes action in terms of the management of risk. This is absolute game changer. And yes, the Paris COP and the G20 were catalysts for that, but it has been driven by the financial sector, by the main institutions in the finance sector who say we need a common framework for this. We need to work together to do this. It has the full weight of the financial sector behind it. And we need to learn from that in terms of the approaches that we make to make sure that the main financial institutions, the progressive leaders in the corporate sector are aligned with our vision for looking at decisions through those three lenses: risk, return, and impact. And if we can manage those things and use this alignment of the stars with the UK and Italy, who have both demonstrated to be supportive of this agenda, I feel that we can make progress. But this is our moment. This is an incredibly important window of opportunity that we have to seize. Marcus,
thanks, Nick. Let me bring another voice, which is also G20 voice, and somebody that has been leading on some issues, from the Central Bank of Mexico, right? Irene Espinosa. Mexico is a G20 country, right? Is a founding member of the Network for Greening the Financial Systems, NGFS. And there is an emergent consensus that central banks have a very active role to play, not only dealing with financial stability, but doing and taking into consideration the implications of climate and other environmental and social risk. And just like Nick mentioned, the need to bring the social, I want to give a little statistic. Since COVID broke, the social bond market has increased threefold, from 10.9 billion to 33 billion. So, suddenly we've seen the social kind of almost catch up with the environmental side of things. So I want to ask you, Irene, why is Banxico involved in this agenda? How are financial regulators in Mexico organizing themselves to take into consideration these broader financial stability implications coming from climate, other environmental and social risk? The floor is yours, Irene. And thanks for joining us. I know there was some difficult arriving here, but we're delighted to have you here with Giovanna and Nick. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. And I am really delighted to participate in this panel. And so happy to be here with you. Yes, of course, Banco de Mexico has been a very active member of greening the finance. Why? Well, because climate change and in general, environmental degradation are sources of financial risks. So the bank has taken on an engagement to create more awareness and more understanding. We need to have to manage and to better understand those risks to avoid financial instability, and also to foster efficient allocation of resources in the economy. So climate and environmental risks are subject to central banks and of course, financial institutions, and should be mainstreamed in risk analysis in all of these activities. By doing so, we are in favor of achieving one of our legal mandates, which is to foster financial systems sound development. So as Nick was saying, I think the current crisis is an excellent opportunity to reevaluate what are the competitive advantages of our countries, and to ensure that the changes and the post-COVID recuperation takes all of these advantages to the benefit in general of the society and of the environment. So I'm sure that there are huge investment opportunities that can benefit from maturing environmentally friendly technologies in most of the sectors. I would say in energy, transportation, telecom, construction, agriculture, and in general in the industry that could benefit and impact people's life. So Banxico, as a founder and active member of the NGFS, really supports the recommendations of the NGFS and also the implementation of those by integrating climate-related risks to financial stability monitoring and also to micro supervision. And this requires a huge engagement in many areas. For example, in building awareness, in encouraging technical assistance and knowledge sharing, the disclosure of these risks and reducing the data gaps. And also, it is very important to discern between environmentally friendly and unfriendly projects. And I think also central banks should lead by example. And we should also include environmental consideration into our operational and management, which we are already doing. But of course, we cannot do this alone. So we need to foster the participation of other financial regulators, private financial sector, and also, and very importantly, the authority that is responsible for the UN SDGs. So we have a financial stability board in Mexico, where we participate with all of the others financial regulators. And Banco de Mexico celebrates that this year, earlier, I think in May or June, the Financial Stability Board set up a Sustainable Finance Committee. And this Sustainable Finance Committee is a high-level group for the dialogue and is responsible for developing and implementing the Sustainable Finance Agenda. In this committee, there are like three groups of participants. One are the financial authorities and regulators, and there is the participation also as observers from the private financial sector through their groups and representatives. And also we have the representative of the government from the presidency that is in charge of the 2030 agenda. So this committee sets really the stage for dialogue with two main goals: mainstreaming physical, transitional, and social risks, and also to foster and promote the identification of opportunities from climate and the pandemic crisis. So in the coming months, we will be defining the agenda of this committee, but we have already set from the board 4 main priorities. One is to create capacities on environmental and climate risk assessment, which is a key pillar to this. Also to generate rules for disclosure disclosure of risks for corporates and also financial institutions, the definition of a national taxonomy, and also to create a proactive agenda for the transition to a low carbon economy. So we are already with I would say, a very strong architecture to set the dialogue, and we are ready to start working harder on these issues.
Thank you very much, Irene. I think this is a fascinating, and I'm delighted to have our last speaker joining us in Kotaro from Japan. We'll get back to you in a minute. But I think it's very interesting, all this conversation. You know, I was saying earlier, you know, yesterday we had a big finance ministers meeting to look at the COVID response and the future. And there are some recommendations coming from central banks specifically in that. So we look forward to working with Banco Mexico on putting some of those elements forward going in that sense. I think the element of what we measure and the rigor of what we measure and how the principles that exist in the world and what we measure translated into the daily lives of investors becomes very important, right?
Mm-hmm.
So one contribution from the United Nations Development Program, and I will make a shout out that my big boss is speaking at 8:15. So when we finish here, let's all go in and listen to Mr. Achim Steiner. One of the things that we are doing is a program called the SDG Impact, where we've actually been working with GSG and the Impact Management Project in creating a series of practice standards for private equity, for use of proceeds of bonds, and for the enterprises. Those standards are trying to, if you want, help translate high-level principles, right, into daily practices that asset managers, asset houses can put in place, which then leads to that disclosure conversation that is so important. It's our small contribution to this in that sense. And this is important because, and this is, I'm coming to Kotaro now, it's important now because, as Ronnie mentioned, we've seen a huge growth of ESG, a huge growth of assets being managed under ESG. But I also think we are also, we celebrate that, but we also feel a few uncomfortable sometimes on how rigor, right, these ESG is. Right? And how truly transformational what we've been calling ESG is. And I think, you know, important elements like TCFD and others that are coming on, and perhaps this conversation of mandatory aspects can tide up this tremendously. In Japan, the evolution of ESG, ESG investment linked to the Japanese vision of a society 5.0, right, share three common themes: forward-looking and pursuing both economic and sustainability. It also mentioned that currently there are two not connected, but the evolution of ESG is critical to truly achieve the SDGs. So it's what I call ESG plus, right? The ones that actually go forward and truly look for that three elements that Nick mentioned of return. Kotaro, in our preparatory conversation for this time, and I'm coming to the second question to you rather than the first, because things have evolved before you arrive. You know, the government of Japan declared that Japan would like to take the lead in international discussion of innovative finance that embrace areas such as social impact investment and dormant asset. How's Japan currently advancing this agenda at an international level? How can you put that agenda at the G20 and at the G7 under the Italian and the UK presence? Over to you, and then after that, we'll just wrap it up and move to see the head of UNDP speak. Kotaro, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Marcos, for that. And I'll, maybe I'll start from what we're doing domestically, because that will feed into the international discussion. So after last year's Osaka G20 summit, what we did right away was to establish a wise persons advisory group to work on the issues that were brought up during the summit, namely impact investment, also ESG investment, blended finance, and also dormant assets. And In fact, the people have done a good work, and they have just come up with a report to our foreign minister this July. And I'll just, since there's some time restraints, I'll just touch on several things that they mentioned in the report on impact investment. I think as you just rightly pointed out, I think the standardization work that is going on is absolutely important. So we are going to, take part in that discussion. And I'm happy that you mentioned about SDG impact, because the person who is chairing that Wise Persons Committee to the Foreign Minister, in fact, is on the board of SDG Impact. And what we are trying to do is to have synergy on the discussion that is going on, including the SDG Impact. There are, I think, also some other initiatives, and then to feed that into our own domestic discussion. Apart from that, also, we're working very closely with Kotaro, which is the Big Business League, also GPIF. They invest using our pension funds, and I think we're having a very good discussion on how we're going to move forward on that kind of standardization. Also, another thing we're discussing is I think there's a lot of work on the E front, environment, but not that much on the S front. So I agree with you. Yes, ESG plus. We need to really, show what that actually is through the international discussion, but also we hopefully we'll be able to show that to our domestic audience, so that the businesses, not just big businesses, but also SMEs within Japan can use that as guidances. And on ESG investments also, I think there's some, we're working on creating incentives for investors. Also, I think some kind of new SDG bonds, that might also be a way forward. So using this input, I think in the near future will be coming, the government will start pushing forward on those fronts. And I think we'll be feeding that discussion into the international discussion, including the SDG impact that you actually handle yourself and lead the discussion. Also, another thing we're doing is our financial service agency has also set up a roundtable along with the GSG National Advisory Board Japan, in fact, and with like 30 or so specialists in the area to kind of share a common view of what the way forward for impact investment is. And so, well, they have just started the process this June, but hopefully, I think in the very near future, they'll come up with some outcomes which we can feed in our own experience. And just lastly, I think SME and the strong emphasis on local entities is one of the things that we have been working upon within Japan. And there are many people working on that front also. So hopefully, I think on that SMEs or localities, we can have some value add to provide to the international discussion. So all these together, well, the Japanese government is serious in dealing with innovative finance to achieve a more sustainable world. And we are investing a lot, and we will definitely follow up, working closely with the G7 and G20 presidencies next year and beyond. Also, just lastly, our leading Liberal Democratic Party is just selecting their new leader, because our Prime Minister just announced that his intention to step down. But in fact, all the three gentlemen who are raising their hands, one was actually the SDGs promotion headquarters vice chief. The chief was our Prime Minister. That's how we formulated our G20 agenda last year in Osaka. And so he'll be continuity of what we have been doing. Another gentleman is his policy group. He's leading a policy group, and the policy group puts SDGs at the core of their policy strategy. And then the third gentleman, he is famous for being a strong advocate on revitalizing the local governments and provinces. And that's exactly what we are doing through the G20 agenda and the SDGs promotion. So regardless of the outcome, which we will know next Monday, the new Prime Minister will also be working along these lines. Thank you.
That is great news to hear that the agenda keeps on strong in Japan. Last time I was in Tokyo, one of the things that impressed me, and I was talking to Kotaro and many of the people you've mentioned, is not only the commitment of the government and the business community towards the SDGs, but I think it's one of the countries where the population knows more about the SDGs than in many other countries around the world. So I think there is a great momentum building up in Japan in that sense. I think this conversation, I'm starting to wrap it up here, this conversation, it's an important conversation, an important element that we can make sure, and it shows why we at the United Nations Development Program are very humbled to have signed a partnership alliance with the GSG, in which we are, not only trying to influence larger G7 and G20 agendas, but also support some of your NABs in developing countries to play the similar role that you're playing in Italy and Japan and in the UK, in other developing countries, as this agenda has to become a true global agenda going forward. So I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank you all for what you do every day. I want to echo Nick when he said that, we are in a historical moment. So Ronnie, when he said that we are achieving the tipping point, we really need to put all hands on deck right now. COVID gives us a lot of misery, a lot of challenges, but it gives us a unique moment in history to transform the system of finance, to transform the underlying causes of the problem that we are seeing today. And I think all of us that have any capacity to influence anyone, right, have a responsibility to the families and the people that gave up their lives on this COVID crisis, and those that are feeling the most. We have a responsibility to fight as hard as we can to make sure that we use this tragic moment as a pivot time to transform the world economy, to transform above all what we all value. As Ronnie said in the opening, we have to value more than just profit. We have to value the social and environmental, that are essential for us to live as a global community and as a society. Thank you very much for everybody.
Thank you.
Go and listen to Ahim now.
Thank you.
And the conversation will carry on for the next 2 minutes.